Like and follow if you love horror. What was delivered to us, almost like a bad joke, was a cryo-frozen shop vac filled with the liquefied remains of our colleague. Reggie broke our silent mourning, more focused on the screen than we were. It looks like they're making a damn circuit board. Reggie might have been on edge, but he was still thinking. And if they know to conserve resources, then how are they communicating it? He looked around at us. They used the rat to observe the environment and determined it was locked. So how does it communicate this information to each nanite? We know it's programmable, but he pulled up his phone and ran it over the reinforced specimen case with the rat, now unfrozen and once again watching us. He punched in an app and waved his phone around the rat. Every few seconds it gave off a low hum. You've got to be kidding me. What the hell is it? I asked our very shocked technician. A frequency tester. Test available frequencies, both radio and microwave. I use it to see if we're being spied on in the lab. It's not very strong and hardly works, but his words were strangled, gasping, panicked. He waved it over the rat, soliciting another hum. This thing is generating low-frequency radio waves. They can all communicate. I ran to the phone and punched in command. General, I asked, but it was a subordinate. No, I need the general. Priority Alpha. There was, of course, resistance to this message. I had inadvertently communicated that a sample had escaped by calling it Priority Alpha. I didn't exactly know how to communicate in military lingo that the creature were bugging us. What is it? General Malak's voice soothed me. We need scramblers, the best you can get, anything to block all frequencies of radio and microwave. I must have sounded panicked as well. Someone snooping? The general asked. No, the damn nanites is snooping, I explained, pinching the bridge of my nose. God knows what it's heard and relayed while we were in the lab. That's a huge problem, the general sighed. We'll get the scramblers in place. Until then, I want absolute silence, no exceptions. There was a pause. I want you to understand, this means we're permanently cut off. We won't be able to easily get communication off base with the scramblers active. While we have a direct encrypted line, until we know the nature of the nanite, we can't risk it. Thank you for letting me know. I'll tell my people. I died a little inside. The idea of being completely cut off was hard to take in. We were already quarantined, but now lacked any ability to communicate to the outside. I couldn't let my family know I was okay. I couldn't tell my girlfriend. If something happened to us, no one would ever know about it. We were completely on our own. There was always the lingering joke that if something classified happened on base and killed us all, we would be nothing more than the footnotes of an eyes-only report, a mystery for our families to unpack emotionally. But here it was, the reality that we, and our deaths, may likely be erased from history. We're in this for the long haul, I sputtered out. Total quarantine and communication silence. From the end of this sentence, we communicate in pen and paper only. Reggie's face bloomed red again. It looked like he might pop or burst into tears, but he just sat there, spasming and sputtering, like he very much wanted to scream. Somehow, he found it in himself to suck it up and bit deep into his hand for support. Sylvia slid me a notepad across the table. We need to focus on killing it. I nodded and pointed to the shop vac. We worked carefully to get it into specimen containment. With that, an important question lingered on my mind. Were the nanobites still alive? Indeed, small arms fire destabilized them enough where they'd lost their cohesive action as a unit, but there was no certainty that disruption killed them. In fact, equal destabilizing force had been used on the rat, and they eventually reconstituted it and themselves. So long as they had food and liquid, they could reproduce, and they knew how to ration the process. The nanites in the wet vac were quite alive. Even worse, as they awoke from hibernation, already exhibiting the same habits and patterns of self-preservation as the rest of the nanites. We hit them with a battery of tests. Any old thing caustic enough to fully destroy their proteins could kill them. Likely even heavy metal poisoning could break them down. though they were resilient. If every single one of them wasn't destroyed, any remaining survivors would immediately reconstitute the colony. It would take a direct blast of radiation to kill them all for certain. This was making it increasingly obvious that destroying the nanites would likely also mean killing the host. What about a virus? Reggie postulated. Now that the scramblers were in place, we could talk again. He had sweat through his clothing and stunk to high heaven. Like a retrovirus, something they can't adapt fast enough to defend against. What about a prion? Sylvia worked with the idea. Literally a rogue protein that by nature assimilates other proteins. Maybe they wouldn't be able to adapt a defense. Hit a creature that assimilates proteins with a rogue protein that destroys proteins. I nodded, but then shook it off. We'll still kill the host. Yeah, eventually, but 5 to 10 years from now as opposed to literally right now. Sylvia shot back in frustration. You want to be the one to explain to some boot that we cured them, but they have 5 to 10 years before they're infirm or brain dead? My tone clearly showed my fatigue and frustration. I'm sorry, the idea is solid, but we have to make a prion that feeds exclusively on the nanites. I can't in good consciousness risk the slow murder of a human like that. No, we're treating this like a virus, but it's a nanite. We should be treating it like a machine. Reggie slammed his hand down on the table in frustration. Settle, Reggie, I yelled, not afraid to bark the fat man down. He composed himself, looked very much like he wanted to cry. We find a way to interrupt their communication, make one incapable of communicating with the other. That assumes they're communicating slowly with radio or microwaves. But if that was the case, the scramblers would effectively be curing our 3 victims in the central cell. They must have a direct way of communicating chemically, and we have to assume that they can eventually adapt new indirect means of communication. I sat and stretched my back out. We could eventually isolate the chemical receptors they use to communicate with each other, but they're very adaptive. They would just keep changing the receptors. I'm sure as we speak, every single cell is trying to work around our scramblers. It's impossible to tell how long we have before they figure it out. There are simply no fast options that don't kill the host, and we can't even design quarantine procedures without understanding how widespread our nanite is. I placed my head in my hands and groaned, attempting to fight off exhaustion. Sylvia, get to work with Reggie on the prion and prion delivery. It would be better to give these grunts 5 years than no years at all, and maybe we can figure out a way to target the treatment to spare the host. All I can give you are computer models. We don't have any samples to manipulate. She crossed her arms and defeatedly thumped her head against the wall of the mobile lab. Closest samples are Cleveland. That means days before we get it, not including the red tape from our current military quarantine. Silence fell across the room. Then a knock came at the door. It was Sergeant Nunez, and he was wearing a beret signifying a higher rank. He was now a sergeant major, and despite his usual perfectly disciplined presentation, was worn thin. Even his dark skin was paler. He simply motioned for me to follow him. Get on those models. If any chance we can cure these men, I want to get at it. I'll see about getting samples through current quarantine. I left with Nunez. Nunez took me to see the general. She too was in her usual presentation of perfect discipline. The bag under her eyes and her skin's pallor told a different story. The 4 other men in the room were in no better shape, and their heavy heads were behind the sights of M16s. I wondered how I looked to them. I must have been downright haggardly. I was worn thin from every angle and teetered on my feet. Thinking on it now, I might have even been trembling. Before it was all over, my hands would start to tremor, but I'm not sure when that began. The office was also formal presentation shellacked over crumbling foundation of stress. It was makeshift and thrown together. Likely the general had abandoned her actual office to stay close to medical. The current office looked like an empty storage room with her filing cabinets, computers, and desks awkwardly jammed in. There were some creature comforts, though. She offered me some coffee, something we didn't have access to when we moved into the mobile lab at medical. Of course, at this point,